What's up, seventh graders? So this is Miss Jones here. I want to talk to you guys about the summative that you have coming up on Friday and give you some of my thinking and some of my strategies on how you could possibly do better and not feel so stressed out about it, okay? The first thing I want to say is that if you don't want to do an essay, you do not have to do an essay, okay? And I'm going to show you some ways where you could do this without doing an essay. First is look at the question. Now, where I have it highlighted, your novel, your character, these things will actually have a character's name from a new story that we've never read before, as well as the name of the story that we haven't read before, okay, when you get here on Friday. But for the purpose of this is for you to practice, okay, so you can use your own novel and your own character. So the first thing I want to do is check it out and see what I want to do. So I have, in your novel, how do your character's flaws and character traits impact the plot of the story? Use evidence from the text to support your thinking. Then the next one is, display the complex relationship between characters and settings in your novel. Use evidence from the text to support your thinking. And what they mean by the complex relationship, they want me to talk about the mood, the atmosphere, and the pressures of a particular place. Next, after reading that, I need to check out my rubric. My rubric wants me to give a timeline or a summary. I don't have to do both. Describe the setting and the character. I have to do both. So here, I already have 3 things I need to do. A timeline or a summary, setting, character. Note ways the setting impacted the character's behavior. So how did the setting impact my character's behavior? Describe in detail the psychological elements of the setting. The mood or atmosphere. So describe in detail the mood and atmosphere. Explain how the pressures of the setting push the characters to behave in certain ways. How the pressures push the character. Also gave insight into how powerful individuals and group dynamics are impacting the setting. How are individuals and group dynamics impacting the setting? Okay? So these are the main things I need to do to at least meet the standard. Okay? A 4 is going above and beyond the standard. All right? So I got to do 4, 5, 6, and 7 things. At least. All right. So the first thing I want to do is, after I've read the question, looked at my rubric, I want to then go back to the question and dissect it. And I did that here. So I took the question, I took both questions and combined them into a basic statement that I know I have to prove to make it a little bit easier on myself. So in Fight, Will's flaws and traits had an effect on the plot of the story because he made certain choices that moved the story in the direction it went. I got that from this question. I got, in your novel, In Fight, Will's flaws and traits impacted the plot, affected the plot of the story. Then they have in here, a character's traits can direct their actions and these actions impact the plot. So that's where I said, because he made certain choices that moved the story in the direction it went. Furthermore, he made those decisions, that goes here. Display the complex relationship between characters and setting. Up here it says, characters' personalities and behavior are strongly impacted by the psychology of the place. So I said, he made those decisions because of the complex relationship he had with the setting of his school. The mood, atmosphere, and pressures of his campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of his classmates. The setting influenced the groups influenced the setting, which impacted Will and made the plot. From here, if I wanted to do an essay, I could then go through and start proving my point based off of everything I said here. So the first point I would prove is how Will's flaws and traits had an effect on the plot of the story. Then I said, he made those decisions because of the complex relationship he had with the setting. He made those decisions because of the mood and atmosphere. Okay? Complex relationship. Then we have the mood, atmosphere, and pressures of his campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of his classmates. Okay? His campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of his classmates. Okay? So I got 3 things that I can talk about and prove. So that's 3 different paragraphs. All right? So my first one, Will's flaws and traits had an effect on the plot of the story. So one could describe Will in Fight as cocky, lonely, I could say fake, cocky, lonely, fake, and still kind of humble. Which I know it doesn't make sense now, but it's going to make sense when I write it, because I'm going to justify why I said these things. Okay? Will was cocky because he thought he was better. Than his peers. For example, on page 1, he said, it was also my turn to lay a condescending hand. Ooh, no. Since Kevin had always been one of my most loyal and servile followers. For example, on page 1, he said, since Kevin had always been one of my most loyal and servile followers. This shows that he thinks he's above Kevin. He's above and superior to Kevin. Superior to Kevin. Because he sees him as a servant. Furthermore, later in the story, he described himself as superior. So he says, During lunch, I was sitting with a table full of friends, talking and listening in my usual superior way. Furthermore, later in the story, he described how he was sitting at lunch in his usual superior way, comma, again showing how he thinks he's better. Okay? I said that he was also lonely, fake, and humble. Okay? So I have this here. Now I'm basically only just going to show you guys how I took Will's flaws and traits had an effect on the plot of the story. So one could describe Will in Fight as blah, 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 as lonely, fake, and humble. Will was cocky because this. So then I could say, had Will not been cocky, he would have apologized. He would have apologized to Mike at the basketball game, at the game, and avoided this whole mess. His cockiness has led him down a path of no return. Okay? So I just talked about how Will's flaws and traits had an effect on the plot of the story. Next, he made those decisions because of the complex relationship he had with the setting of the school. So I talked about him being cocky. So now I can talk about why is he cocky. Okay? So I could say, Will isn't cocky just to be cocky. He is actually very humble. Because throughout the whole chapter, throughout the whole story, he talks about how he really wanted to do things differently. Okay? So then I'm going to talk about how he couldn't do that though. So how he really wanted to do things differently. Okay. So now I'm back here. He made those decisions because of the complex relationship that he had with the setting. Will couldn't do things differently. Differently though, because his school was a place where he had to act tough. And I can put something here where he says, I was really going to throw, he said, I would fight him anytime, anywhere. I don't know why I said this. He also talks about in the beginning, in those days I had a reputation for toughness to maintain. So I told him that he better watch out. I think I'm going to use both of those. Okay. I had a reputation for toughness to maintain is what Will says after he and Mike have their pushing match. During the basketball game. During the basketball game. He also said I don't know why I said this. I would fight him anytime, anywhere. I don't know why I said this. Anytime, anywhere. I don't know why I said this. I don't know why I said this. Period. Okay? So he also said, I would fight him anytime, anywhere. I don't know why I said this. While he was walking home with Kevin, bragging and boasting about fighting Mike if the opportunity came. Let me go back to my beginning of my paragraph. I said, Will isn't cocky just to be cocky. He is actually very humble because throughout the whole story, he talks about how he really wanted to do things differently. Will couldn't do things differently, though, because his school was a place where he had to act tough. I had a reputation for toughness to maintain, is what Will says after he and Mike have their pushing match during the basketball game. He also said, I will fight him anytime, anywhere. I don't know why I said this while he was walking home with Kevin, bragging and boasting about fighting Mike if the opportunity came. All of this is evidence of how horrible the atmosphere of his school was. He was at a school where he had to be strong, tough, and mean to survive. Okay? So now I have that. The next is his campus. Let me see. The mood atmosphere of his campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of his classmates. So now I can add this on. Will's school was one where the mood felt competitive and lonely. Competitive and lonely. The atmosphere was violent. Okay, so I have my last one. How the campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of its classmates. So Will's school was one where the mood felt competitive and lonely. The atmosphere was violent and unsafe. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. I sat through my classes smiling, a silent shell of my former self. So on page two, after Will has agreed to fight Mike, the next day, he describes how scared he is. So he says, the rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. I sat through my classes, a smiling, silent shell of my former self. The next day, he described how scared he is. I sat through my classes, a smiling, silent shell of my former self. This metaphor where he describes himself as a shell shows how the school environment makes him feel scared and alone. Okay? Then so Will's school was one where the mood felt competitive and lonely. The atmosphere was violent and unsafe. On page 2, after Will has agreed to fight Mike the next day, he describes how scared he is. I sat through my classes, a smiling, silent shell of my former self. This metaphor where he describes himself as a shell shows how the school environment makes him feel scared and alone. So I'm almost done here. I have behaviors and actions of his classmates. So how was that mood created by his classmates? Okay, so this setting was created by his classmates' mob mentality. They all seem excited about a fight. So where's my evidence of that? During my walks from class, I discovered that most of the 8th grade had taken sides and that my side consisted of me, a foreign exchange student named Hans, and 2 girls whose hearts I had not yet broken. The rest of my peers were massed behind Mike, eager to see me put in my place once and for all. They all seemed excited about a fight. So then I'm going to put right here, I discovered, I'm going to just put most of the 8th grade had taken sides. Most of the 8th grade had taken sides. I'm putting ellipses right here to continue the thought. And I'm going to say, my peers were massed behind me. My peers were massed behind Mike. My peers were massed behind Mike, eager to see me put in my place. From the imagery of the word mass, I can imagine a large group of kids behind Mike, like a mountain, like a forest, and Will standing in an empty field. Okay. All right. The way his classmates are behaving is making the school a place where one would always be on edge, would always be on defense. Period. Okay. Then I said, so I talked about the mood campus were created by some of the behaviors and actions of his classmates. All right. Now I did all of that, okay? Would be on defense. I would never want to go to a school like this. But I know that there are schools where students feel the need to fit in and not be themselves. So this is where I'm going to start making my own personal reflection and my text to text, text to self, or text to world connections, okay? So my reflection is, this story made me wonder what I could do as a teacher to make sure that I kept my school environment safe and accepting. Okay, so that was my reflection. Okay. It also made me feel bad for Will. It must have been a horrible childhood to never be able to be himself, to be true to himself. The idea that he would be lonely, whether popular or not, is so depressing. It's so depressing. This reminded me of, and I can make my text connection, okay? This reminded me of my own childhood. I had many of the same pressures, but I also had caring teachers who encouraged me to not follow the crowd and find joy in being alone sometimes. And how to appreciate people who were more like me. All right. So from here, guys, I have answered everything I needed to answer. And if I go back and I look at the rubric, I gave a timeline of the story. I described the setting and the character. I paraphrased some statements. I noted ways that the setting impacted his behavior. I described the mood and the atmosphere. I explained how the setting had pushed pressure on him. I talked about how his classmates impacted the setting. I explained how I felt as a reader about the character and the setting. And I made some connections. All right. I also, in here, I put a quote from the text that support how I describe the character, a quote from the text that supports how I describe the setting. I use transition statements. For example, on page, I did all of this. I connected the evidence to my inference. I said things like, this is proof of, and this shows. I did that. I selected evidence that used figurative language. Remember, I talked about the metaphor and the imagery. And I identified which one he used and why the author used it. So that's how I would do it if I was to write an essay. I wouldn't do two different essays. I would do one essay and I would do everything in that one essay. So I would answer both questions with one paper. Let's talk about how I would go about doing this. The way I would go about responding to these questions, if I didn't want to write an essay, I would do it visually. I know that I need to do a summary or a timeline. So my summary would be right here. I would summarize each part of the story. The exposition, which is the beginning, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then I would put how it resolved itself, okay? So Will is playing basketball. He accidentally bumps into Mike, and the two are pushing one another. From there, Will is walking home and bragging to a friend about how he will fight Mike if he messes with him again. Mike confronts Will. Will agrees to fight even though he doesn't really want to, and he's scared all day until they fight while his classmates egg it on. Will wonders if he can beat Mike, but realizes he can't. He can't fight, but doesn't back down because he has a reputation to keep up. Will gets beat up, loses popularity, and feels weightless. From here, I added text evidence that proved this stuff. So, for example, I proved that Will is bragging by saying, and told him that the next time Mike and I played basketball, I was really going to throw some elbows. I will fight him anytime. I explained that this shows how Will feels the need to brag and show off, as if he has to prove something to his peers. Here, I gave him the fight, the love notes, the phone calls. For a moment, I felt very weightless. This hyperbole shows how heavy a burden being popular is, and that by losing the fight, he may have lost that burden. And then I put my idea behind this. This is my text to self connection. This story reminded me of my childhood. Kids too busy trying to be popular and not just having fun, and adults too busy to pay attention to the kids and ensure our safety and inclusion with everyone. So what did I do by doing this? If I went back to my checklist, by doing this, I did a timeline. I paraphrased statements. I identified literary device where I talked about the hyperbole. Okay. I selected evidence that showed the author's use of figurative language. I used transition statements, and I connected my evidence to my inferences. Okay. So I did all of that when I said this shows, for example. Okay. All right. So I did that. Then it said noted ways. Let me see. Describe these psychological elements. Explain how the pressure of the setting pushed the character to behave in certain ways. I didn't really do that. I did explain how I thought. No, I made a connection to the text. I did that with just that one image. That's all the stuff I did, guys, by just doing this right here. Then I needed to describe the setting. So I described the setting. I described the setting as violent, competitive, and unsafe. The students make up the rules to a fight and want to see a fight. They place bets and encourage the fighting. For example, I saw a crowd of 50 or 60 people. Someone said, "Let's go." I heard someone say, "A fight is a fight." All of these are evidence of how his peers wanted to see violence. So many kids showed up. They made up rules, and in the end decided anything would go. This makes the school a mob-like place. I said it was competitive. They are playing basketball, a competitive sport, shoving fingers in one another's faces and chests. For instance, I had a reputation for toughness to maintain, so I told him he better watch out. This shows how competitive the school is because Will has to maintain a look that really isn't who he is. If the school wasn't competitive, where kids are always sizing one another up, Will could have been himself and apologized. and apologize to Mike. This is important because it shows how he feels by himself and how he feels like a target. Oh, wait, no. This goes with this one. Okay. Unsafe. There are no adults monitoring the students, and Will feels all alone. For example, he says, I had never felt so lonely or so frightened in my life. This is important because it shows how he feels by himself and how he feels like a target. Put a box right here. Okay? So this is how this does. I would hate to be at this school. It sounds like a fish eat fish place and not good for learning or growing. Okay? So I put another thought in there. And then finally, I described Will. But before I talk about that, let's see what I did with the setting. I described the setting. I did that. I noted ways the setting impacted the behavior. Yep. I described the elements of the setting, the mood and the atmosphere. Yep. I explained how the pressure of the setting pushed the characters to behave in certain ways. I did that. Also gave it and I did that where I said Will could have been with himself and apologized to Mike. So right there, I talk about how the competitive nature of the school is pushing him to act in a way that he's not. Also gave insight into how powerful individuals and group dynamics are impacting the setting. I did that right here, where I talked about how violent the school is. I put a quote from the text that supports how I am describing the setting. Now let's talk about the character. Will. I said Will is cocky. I said he's humble. Cocky. Since Kevin had always been one of my loyal and servile followers, this shows that he thinks he's above others because he considers Kevin to be his servant and not his equal. Humble. In the story toward the end, Will talks about finally getting what he deserves. This let us know that he is aware of his bad ways and knows that he is wrong. Pressures affecting him. The need to fit in, wanting to be himself, but afraid. Makes Will act tougher than he is. Makes Will brag to Kevin. Keeps Will from apologizing when he first bumped into Mike. All these decisions led to the fight. Keeps his true feelings to himself. He keeps people around who really aren't his friends. Kevin goes back and tells everyone that Will wants to fight. Is he also competitive in being impacted by the school environment? If Kevin wasn't being impacted by the school environment, would he have kept Will's secret? And then I have my thoughts on this. This made me feel sorry for Will, but also not like Will. Why wasn't he strong enough to overcome his setting? I think there are people in the world like this. There are too many people making decisions just to fit in instead of being true to themselves. I explained how I felt as the reader. I described the character. And I put quotes that support my description of the character. That's everything, guys. I hope that these two help you to see that you can either do this visually in multiple ways, or you can write an essay, okay? And I hope this calms some of your fears with getting ready to do this. Have a wonderful evening.